Hey, my name is Patrick Lovell, and I'm recording this on January 27th, 2022. It's hard to believe that it's 2022. I feel like it's Groundhog Day, considering this crazy world that we live in. I'm looking haggard. I look like I feel. I feel horrible. I just got back from a hike. I'm not shaven, and I just feel compelled to try to express something that matters because I'm really having a hard time feeling that anything matters, to be honest with you. Some of you know me because we've made a pretty decent sized effort to get the word out to the world through a television series that I co-produced and actually was the narrator and the protagonist of, called The Con. And it was a monumental effort on behalf of myself, my colleagues, Eric Vaughn and Adam Bronfman, and so many others that worked with us through Redpoint Digital, and of course all of the wonderful human beings that met along this incredible journey. Um, some of you are familiar with my story. Some of you may have kind of gotten bits and pieces of it through social media, but I think largely, um, a vast majority of people have absolutely no idea who I am and probably never will. There's so much information, there's so much noise, there's so much disinformation, and there's so much confusion. Reminds me of a Jimi Hendrix song, quite frankly. Said the Joker to the thief, right? But why am I bothering to record myself as if anybody's going to listen or if anybody cares, quite frankly? You know that feeling you get when really all is lost and you're really at the end of your rope and you don't think that there's any way forward because you have done everything you can to try to endure another day. Um, that tends to pile more challenges on you than you could ever wish on your worst nightmare, or wish on your worst enemy, I should say. And where you feel like you're in quicksand and you feel like there is nothing but darkness ahead, and that there's really no reason to go on. I know it sounds suicidal. I'm not, quite frankly, saying that in that context, although I promise you, thoughts of ending it all sometimes definitely cross my mind, but I don't think I have enough courage to do that. And unfortunately for me, there are people in my life that care for me and that I care for deeply that I just can't imagine leaving. And so therefore, I'll probably endure another day. But I feel that, given where I'm coming from, I just have to express something because, it just seems like we're in a massive dystopia dead end where I know there are millions of you out there that are feeling the same way that I do at this moment and have throughout so many different times of the last, quite frankly, 13 years. And you desperately want answers. So many of you have probably endured just as much as I have. I interact with people on Twitter. I interact with people on social media sometimes where I get told these stories that are just excruciatingly painful, but so necessary to understand. So, for the really uninitiated, I'm a guy that just had a lot of questions after the collapse of the great financial crisis of 2008. I am a producer. I have been a producer for a long time. I'm a family guy. Ideologically, I believe in life, liberty, in the pursuit of happiness. I believe in the American dream. I was of the mindset that this was the greatest country on earth from the standpoint that I always kind of figured that we were on that long road in March in order to form a more perfect union. And I always believed in the credibility and the integrity of the system. And that's why after the collapse of the great financial crisis in 2008, nothing made sense. It was so disorienting because I was in a new home with a young family. I had just gone from being a successful producer on a television show giving away houses to where suddenly that show lost its funding. It went belly up. I became unemployed. I had these huge bills because I was into my first house. And things, were becoming suffocating. It was like getting buried in an avalanche. And, to mix metaphors, I mean, ultimately this thing spit me out on a desert naked and, trying to be in a survival mode to protect my family. And as a result of that, I'll never forget my wife and I at the time, we had to really change our lifestyle completely. We went from, making pretty decent money to having to desperately go get 2 jobs apiece in the service industry to maintain a quarter of income that we that had before, and no time to spend with our young son. And it was incredibly debilitating. And as a producer and someone that really understood how to ask questions, quite frankly, because I had always been someone who asked questions. I've always been involved with the state of affairs in this world, going back my entire life, and I kind of thought I understood how things worked. I studied political science in college, and I pursued a career in Hollywood, and I was able to work my way up through the system to become a producer. And I was actually doing what I thought most of us were taught we should do and expect if we work our way through the system. And suddenly, as the whole thing exploded, imploded, fell on our heads, things didn't make sense. So I started to ask questions, and we started to pull the thread. And I had the great fortune of going to someone in my neighborhood. Some of you have heard the story before, but I think it bears repeating. And I went to a gentleman who became the executive producer of this massive quest that's literally 10 years in the making. And I asked him, I said, listen, none of this stuff makes sense. I would love to try to find out how everything that I base my life on, which is based on upward mobility, fairness, integrity of a system, and that those who work through the system become successful, was no longer delivering that. And it just seemed to completely self-destruct. And I went to him because his family had been extremely successful in previous generations, fighting against all odds to really become one of the great wealth stories in the United States. And I had positioned to him, I just simply want to find out what happened to the American dream as someone who is living the American nightmare. And his response to me, I'll never forget, was, if you can figure out how we went of, by, and for the people to of, by, and for the corrupt corporation, then I'm in. And that launched this incredible journey. And here we are. And so I just got back from a hike. My world's falling apart again. It's 2022, and I feel like it's Groundhog Day. Why? Because every single day we are reminded and shown different degrees of a massive, massive criminal enterprise that everyone is aware of, but nobody seems to understand. Now, we spent the last literally 13 years crisscrossing this country 12 times, maybe more than that, picking up the pieces of the puzzle and following the leads like a great detective mystery. And I'll never forget my partner on this quest, Eric Vaughn, who I think is probably the most talented individual I've ever met in my life. The guy who can really do anything and is so brilliant. It's remarkable. And and I'll never forget, at the very beginning, he used to think of me. He'd frame me as Captain Ahab, in search of the white whale. And I'll tell you, this many years later, that's exactly what it feels like, because as we started to uncover answers to questions that we had, we just went through this process of discovery. And this process of discovery led us to what are known as whistleblowers, but I'd like to refer them as truthsayers, really. Courageous people and individuals who were like me in a system that didn't make sense, that they began to ask questions, and then they started to do the right thing, because there are a lot of people that have dignity, that have integrity, that pursue honesty and believe in truth and justice, and quite frankly, they thought that's what their job was, as that's what it actually said in their contracts, depending on the level of their professional kind of level. And that journey led us to people like, for example, Michael Winston. Michael Winston is an amazing human being that worked at the time at Countrywide, and he was involved with human resources and some other activity, and he started mulling around and pushing around and trying to figure out things that didn't make sense to him. And one thing led to another, and he started to understand that it was a mammoth criminal enterprise. And this is the largest mortgage broker in the United States at the time. And he did what any professional would do, especially in his position. He's what they call a grill. And what that meant was that he was supposed to be kind of an internal kind of professional mechanism that would present truthful information to Moody's and other credit rating agencies and others in the business press that would kind of justify the credibility of what the company was. In fact, I'll never forget learning that at one point, I think there was an article in Forbes magazine that described Countrywide as the 24,000% increase company. The numbers were astronomical, and as time went on, and this was probably in the 2002 to 2006 era, the company was just growing like nothing before in history. And Michael Winston, a professional who had come from other aspects of corporate America like Merrill Lynch and Motorola, and he had 3 degrees and he was a high-level executive, started finding out that, wait a second, this thing is a criminal enterprise. And he started to go to the executives that he had access to because he was in the C-suites, and that included the CEO of the operation, a gentleman by the name of Angelo Mazzillo. And Angelo Mazzillo was, if you've seen pictures of this guy or video, it's a caricature. I mean, it's unbelievable. This guy is this super tanned, New Jersey Italian guy that relocated to California, and he just looked like this personification of, the Los Angeles kind of convertible cool factor. CEO, great guy, and he's got this amazing, financial credentials and press that are saying he's, the greatest thing since sliced bread. And Michael is like, wait a second, this company is hiring really the lowest of the low educated to work in a company that there was extreme turnover in. And as he started to unwind why that was, he found out that people who weren't making quotas and numbers would be thrown to the trash, and those that were superstars became incredible superstars. But then he started to find out that they were selling a fraudulent product, because one day a convertible Benz rolls into the parking lot and it says on the license plate, fund him. And he's like, wait a second, what does that mean? And the guy's like, fund him. And he's like, what do you mean fund him? Don't you have to have criteria and collateral and underwriting and all of those things that go into what our product is? He's like, no, if you can fog a mirror, we'll fund him. And so Michael is like, are you kidding me? And he goes to the human resources. He goes to the folks in the C-suite, and everybody starts basically shunning him and pushing him away and then threatening him. And he had like a staff of, I think at the time, let's just say it was numerous. And I think they got rid of like 90% of his staff. I think they got 90% of his budget because he was asking questions and they were trying to actually get rid of him. One thing leads to another and the company implodes. He's got another story that leads to an absolute tragedy where the poor guy got laryngeal throat cancer. I think he's on his 30th throat surgery. I don't know how he's still alive. For the life of me, I can't understand how he can still actually talk. But it certainly seems like whether it was intended or just coincidental, somehow something wanted him not to talk. And, whether that's the truth or not, that's the outcome. And the guy endured, like so many others that we met, just extraordinary pain and suffering and professional hardships and so on and so forth. And he goes to the court system. He ends up winning, a large wrongful termination suit against the company that was then later overturned by an appellate court. And why is that relevant? Well, because an appellate court really went out of the way to overturn a decision. Now, about the same time, one of the biggest financial institutions in the world, Bank of America, engulfed, incorporated Countrywide, which at the time seemed very peculiar because Countrywide stock was going south quickly. People were starting to get wind that the company wasn't exactly everything it was cracked up to be. And lo and behold, our friend Michael Winston gets churned and burned in the courts, and he's been on a mission ever since to try to make the world aware of what happened to him in the courts. Now, what happened to him in the courts, as it turns out, is what's happened to literally millions upon millions of people. So as we followed this thread forward, I was trying to figure out, okay, wait a second, this is looking like a pipeline. This looks like a criminal enterprise in a pipeline. And this journey led us to a gentleman by the name of Dick Bowen, Richard Bowen, out of Dallas, Texas, and he was working for Citigroup at the time. And when I started doing my initial research, I learned, because he was on 60 Minutes, what his story was. And I started reading a wonderful editorialist for the New York Times at the time who would pose the question, was Richard Bowen silenced? And as I started to dig into Richard's story, it was unbelievable because it was connected to Michael Winston. And how it was connected to Michael Winston is that Countrywide was providing incredible volumes of loans through securitization to banks like Citigroup. And so Richard Bowen was what they called a chief underwriter. He'd gotten, in his words, a promotion that led him to work with the gods in New York. And it was his job to do the investigations into the securities that Citibank, the largest bank in the world, was selling to investors around the world. I think at the time, at the end of this time period, it was to the tune of something around $90 billion a year. And these securities that Richard Bowen was finding out were fraudulent. And the reason that's important is they were made up with the worst of the worst, what we called liar's loans, that constituted these securities that were then sold into mortgage-backed securities that then had a whole host and array of derivatives action on them, which is like gambling, at the casino, maybe on roulette on somebody else's bet, whether or not those loans would perform. And Richard Bowen was literally looking into the loans that they were securitizing, and he was finding out that 80% of what he was looking into did not meet their reps and warranties. So why is that important to the, once again, uninitiated? Because not a lot of people grow up to understand securities and financialization. They just kind of want to grow up and live in a world that works. Just like we all have expectations if we get on a plane that it's going to fly us to our destination, or if we get in a car that the brakes are going to work. But in this particular case, somebody who's on in the inside, who is a professional, who has the ethics and a long history of doing so, the right stuff under these particular circumstances, was making his boss, and then later his boss's boss, and then later everybody within the system that were the executives that were under the law Sarbanes-Oxley liable for the reps and warranties that Citibank was selling to the world. And he was notifying them that they were selling securities that were going to blow up. Now, instead of the company just automatically stopping the practice and getting a hold of it and clearing it up and doing all of those things that you would expect from some executives that were paid incredible amounts of money to be able to know exactly what their company was doing and operating under, instead of them fixing the problem, what they did, of course, was, just like in the case of Michael Winston, they unceremoniously showed him the door. Offered him retirement, offered him a package, told him don't talk. And of course, Richard Bowen, being the guy that he is, a man of God, quite frankly, a man of dignity and integrity and also courage, was in a bind. But then he just thought, I got to make the people who are responsible to know what to do with this type of information aware of it. And so he did. He goes to the Security and Exchange Commission. Those are the cops on the beat. The Security and Exchange Commission was created in 1933 after the Great Depression because there was this investigation known as the Pecora hearings that led to the financial system at that time up to many of the same deceptive acts and practices that were occurring in 2008. And what that time period did after the leadership of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration came into office was they looked to fix the problems that had created the Great Depression. And they did that by doing several things, one of which was creating Glass-Steagall. Glass-Steagall was a mechanism by which investment banks couldn't speculate in commercial banks, meaning they couldn't speculate with other people's money to gamble, on really risky bets. So we created the FDIC, which would guarantee the government guarantee of people's money in banks so that they would prevent a bank run. And then ultimately, they created the Securities and Exchange Commission of 1933 and the Securities Exchange Act of 1933, which prevented illegal, deceptive acts and practices that ultimately guaranteed that there had to be reps and warranties that merited what they were saying in the prospectuses. And what that means is that the products that these investment banks would be selling would have to actually be what they say they were selling, as opposed to what Richard Bowen was finding. So what does that mean in the long run? So Richard Bowen gets thrown in the door. He goes and talks to the SEC. He ends up in what they call the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, where the government, after the great financial crisis, looked to actually be doing the investigation to find out what exactly had caused all these problems. And Richard Bowen had sent literally thousands of emails, or presented thousands of emails of all of the investigators of who knew what, when, and how, and what they were hiding and why. And what were they hiding? They were selling illegal reps and warranties to the world. That blew up. And so what happened was, like I already mentioned, they showed Richard Bowen the door. He couldn't get anybody to listen to him. He gets investigated ultimately, and he goes to these public hearings, but because of some crazy things that happen with, signing certain things away with, a package deal that he did, he couldn't say certain things, and he could only rely on the investigators to ask certain questions. It gets a little murky and complicated, but the long and the short of it is that I want you to know, in that particular case, Citigroup ended up beating the investigation because of some major insider players, and that's another story. But they were able to do that by basically ignoring Richard Bowen's testimony, what he did, that if the FBI and the SEC actually did what they were supposed to do given the evidence, then the aftermath wouldn't have happened. And what was the aftermath? Well, Robert Rubin, a guy who was at the apex of the operation, who was a former Goldman Sachs CEO turned Treasury Secretary under then President Clinton, that then became chairman of Citigroup, who was in the midst of all of what constituted what I'm telling you, ended up denying any understanding of what he was being told by Richard Bowen directly, who sent him emails directly when he was named chairman of exactly what was going on. And then Rubin did a shuffle dance that ultimately enabled him to basically skirt prosecution. And Citibank walked with $3 trillion for basically blowing up the world. They weren't the only ones. They all did it. Now, beyond all of that, the question becomes then, well, wait a second. If they were all able to do it, what were they doing? They were doing this criminal enterprise that I told you, based on illegal reps and warranties that were backstopping and fueling liar's loans from the beginning that got put into these ginormous packages, sold into pension funds around the world and investors around the world. And why would they do that? Because the way it works in finance and banking is that people get paid fees for moving product forward. The question is, would you loan money to somebody who couldn't afford to pay it back? Well, in this case, you did. Why? Because ultimately, in the example I just gave you, in terms of Citigroup walking with $3 trillion, as it turns out, Uncle Sam, or a lot of people would like to parse hairs on what that actually means in context to the Federal Reserve, literally provided emergency stimulus funds, of which led to that $3 trillion backstop of what Citigroup was doing illegally around the world. Giant illegal criminal enterprise that ultimately not only made money on the fees the entirety on the way up, but when they blew up the world and everybody else, they got to walk with trillions and trillions of dollars that were backstopped for their losses to keep them obviously moving forward. And that number sounds extraordinary until you understand that actually, and I got to set it up like this, in the aftermath of the great financial crisis, There was a lot of haggling going back and forth in Congress. President Obama had just been elected president, riding a populist wave of change we can believe in. And when he came into office after the Bush administration had already been dealing with this absolute disaster crisis, what we had at the time, the Treasury Secretary was Hank Paulson, who was also a former Goldman Sachs CEO, who actually was heavily indebted or involved, I should say, with Goldman Sachs's action in the mortgage-backed security market. He ends up becoming Treasury Secretary, and then both he and, of course, all of the people that were involved, within the system, the chief regulator, the president of the New York banking, I got to think of what his title was at that time, but Timothy Geithner came out of the New York Fed, which he was a regulator, quite frankly, and of course Alan Greenspan throughout this whole time was the chief regulator of the Federal Reserve, and ultimately you have Ben Bernanke, who was an expert in the Great Depression and was also head of was transitioning at the Federal Reserve after Alan Greenspan as head of the Federal Reserve. And so what ultimately transpired was that the press reported that there was a program called TARP, the Troubled Assets Relief Program, that provided $700 billion of emergency lending to Wall Street to create liquidity in the system. And as part of that, a lot of people didn't really fully understand it at the time, but it was to acquire bad assets, get it off the books of the bank so that they could be, free to lend, and then we could put that on, Uncle Sam's account. Basically, what we did was we took the bad assets, and obviously we transferred that to Uncle Sam, who could sit on it for a long time. And in the process, everybody thought in media we're talking about $700 billion, which became $750 billion, because $50 billion of that was used supposedly to help homeowners that were going through the foreclosure process, and that was known as the Home Affordable Modification Program. But $29 trillion was lent to Wall Street and all of these major firms, and quite frankly, a very small percentage of them in terms of the giant apparatus of financial operations around the country. It was pretty much given a vast majority of this emergency lending to the majority of the bad players who represents a minority of the financial system. So that's where we came up with this notion of too big to fail. And that's the world that basically gave birth to my new life, because my life before that was, okay, we have people that are professionals in positions of power that make sure the system runs efficiently because we're a superpower. We have incredibly educated and bright, smart people that obviously have professional decorum. And so as somebody on the outside, you just expect that the system is going to function properly. But suddenly, because all of this stuff wiped out and I'm in the situation in the crosshairs of it all, my life is completely coming unglued and collapsing. And it's very difficult, as many of you know. When I think back to it, it's just extraordinarily horrific nightmares, quite frankly, to remember back to that era. And when the world is falling on you, when you've got responsibilities, you feel a degree of desperation, and many people react to that and express themselves differently. Many people committed suicide. Many people got divorces. Many people went homeless. And it was all a result because everybody was set up in a system that was a fictional enterprise that ultimately buried the middle class of the United States and our functioning, real estate market and finance markets, and just the way things work within the economy of the United States. And that was after 4 decades of neoliberalism that led to financialization, and it was a train wreck of extraordinary proportions. And in the aftermath, we all depended upon the Obama administration to clean it up, fix it, try to right the ship back, and that's what we all voted for, and that's not what happened. We, as a production unit, went through the process of the painstaking investigation of understanding every aspect of what created this problem, and then we became knowledgeable by speaking to professionals on the inside from the FBI, from the Department of Justice, from the SEC, AGs across the country, and of course, whistleblowers of incredible courage and professionalism that all came together to tell the same story, that this was all a engineered crime spree. And we really didn't understand how it worked or we could give it form until we came across a gentleman by the name of William K. Black. And William K. Black is a guy that I'd vaguely heard about during the S&L crisis because I'm that old, and that happened in the late 80s and the early 90s. But I didn't really fully understand his role until one day I was channel surfing on a Sunday morning. I came across a show on the Bill Moyers program, which is a little, probably relatively obscure for most people. It was on PBS, and Bill Moyers is a great host and interviewer of great intellectual journalistic credibility. And he had Bill Black on, and Bill Black suddenly started checking off all of these boxes of how he presented what had happened in a way that I could suddenly understand, that it was all making sense. And when I heard him, I was like, my God, why in the world doesn't the world, literally the government, why isn't this guy Bill Black the guy in charge at the Department of Justice? Why isn't he the guy that is in charge of doing an investigation into what Wall Street had done to be able to right the ship? And again, prior to this time period, that's what I had thought was the role of the US government. That's what I had thought was the society we lived in. I think most of us that came out of the time period from the 70s and the 80s understood that, a lot of really bad stuff could happen. I mean, it's not like we didn't understand Vietnam and all the turmoil of the 60s and then into the 70s and 80s and everything from, mafia, in the big cities and the turmoil in the inner cities to things like in the 80s, like, Contragate. And then ultimately the things like, the first rung of what I would refer to as the first financial disaster of the United States that came through junk bonds and the magnitude of what Michael Milken was up to at that time period that he was later held accountable for. That was really the first, I'd say, indication of financialization overrunning everything in the United States. And, we got through all of that time period. Mostly, we saw bad things happen, but eventually you would see bad guys get held accountable. And, I think a lot of us at that time had believed in Ronald Reagan and, kind of thought that, bureaucracies are bad and that the free market is good and that, professionals with dignity and integrity and the greatest generation, would always, err on the side of what we all believed was, the shining city on the hill, right? The shining country on the hill, or however George Bush the first had described it. And but what we didn't know is what I would learn from Bill Black in that seminal moment where he appeared on Bill Moyers. And what I would later learn, because I reached out to him and I was able to create a relationship where I was able to learn firsthand knowledge of how this whole thing worked. And we were taught that all of this stuff came unglued, really starting with Reagan and going all the way through, I think, a critical time period in the late 90s through the Clinton administration that basically led to what we call the 3 Ds: deregulation, desupervision, and decriminalization. And really all that means, guys, is that the United States government was inundated, I'd say hijacked, by incredibly motivated, ambitious entities that were highly organized, that understood the law, that understood how to write the laws, that understood how big money could be made for certain institutions if we got rid of certain laws. And at that time period, those things that I had mentioned to you earlier in this dialogue were the likes of the things that came out of the Pecora investigations in the early 30s that led to Glass-Steagall and, of course, the Securities and Exchange Commission. And throughout the late 90s, it was always under attack, but Glass-Steagall, which was the separation of commercial and investment banking that put the onus and alignment on investment with outcome, was disbanded. And it was disbanded because Citigroup at that time, was led by both Jamie Dimon, quite frankly, in second position, and the gentleman's name who eludes me at the moment, Sandy Weil, who became the CEO of Citigroup. They created what was known as a supermarket bank, and they worked with Phil Gramm out of Texas, and they knew the levers of power in government, and they had this attitude to deregulate everything, which means create an atmosphere where people who are thieves that are very clever can create diabolical matrices of financialization that would set people up so that they could make huge fees in a smoke and mirrors fictional economy while ultimately not being on the hook for the downside if things blew up. I learned later, speaking with people like Eliot Spitzer, former AG of the state of New York and, of course, governor, and he has an incredible story as well. But I remember speaking with him on camera, and he had said to us, the three most dangerous languages in money are other people's money. And what they did was they basically were so clever, and they being the financial system and some of the smartest people in the world who come out of the best schools in the world, who are the most highly compensated, came up with different ways to find the short-term path to huge profits that did not have any downside. Meaning that what we learned through Bill Back is that this is called control fraud. And control fraud is when CEOs, the boss of a seemingly legitimate operation, is actually running a con. And that con is to, sell as many loans as possible without underwriting, without buffers and margin for leverage, and so that they can create insane upside into providing as many loans as possible. And the backstory to that was that there was $70 trillion sloshing around the global market looking for great places to put its money. And up until that point, the housing market was as safe and as stable as it gets. And so there was this incredible, after 9/11, growth in the housing industry, even though the economy had stagnated. And at the apex of who was supposed to be regulating that activity was none other than Alan Greenspan, who was the head of the Federal Reserve. And a lot of people at that time were always intrigued with Greenspan. Greenspan was a guy who'd go on and speak in these kind of like anagrams, I guess. He wouldn't really say anything directly that the public could hear, but it was like Chauncey Gardner, quite frankly, if you've ever seen that wonderful performance by Peter Sellers and Being There. And really, it was all smoke and mirrors to enable this fraudulent crime enterprise that was taking place behind the scenes that started with liar's loans that get pushed through with illegal reps and warranties through a system of all of these checks and balances that everybody was getting paid to actually look the other way so that Wall Street can continue pumping this out around the world, which ultimately ignited the world, blew up the world, and then when everybody got destroyed by that, the Federal Reserve gave them $29 trillion to start again, and we've been living with that reality ever since. So why am I puking my guts out here to you, looking like crap on a day where nobody's listening and everybody is looking for answers? I don't know if it's going to be anything that is seen by anyone or penetrates. I'm at a loss. I don't know what to do. We have a full-throated series called The Con that shows you all of this and so much more. It's the investigation and quite frankly, it's the truth that everybody in power wants to make sure you don't understand. The Con was the largest criminal conspiracy in history and largest cover-up in history. And it's created the world that we live in. I'll give you just a couple of examples of what's been coming at me left and right, which I think has motivated me to want to try to talk and try to get people's attention because it's just out of control. So, for example, I think many of us are quite aware that mainstream media, especially those of us who tend to put echo chamber cable within that construct of mainstream media, have not been telling us the story. Most of us understand that the system is rigged. We understand it's rigged for the powerful. A lot of people like to call these guys elites. I don't think of them as elite. I think of people like Michael Jordan or Tom Brady or anybody who's got a whole bunch of rings for being a spectacular athlete that continues to, year in, year out, um, get to that level as elite. I don't think of people who lie, steal, and cheat and deceive and do so with immunity as elites. I think of them as criminals. And currently in the mainstream echo chamber blogosphere, we have scenarios like Rachel Maddow, for example, who is revealing nightly that Donald Trump is a fraud, that he's a con. She's talking about stuff that's happening and being revealed through the New York Attorney General's office. Letitia James revealed some stuff last week that's quite frankly amazing, right? It's amazing if you don't understand what she's talking about, but just consider for a second they had revealed that, for example, Donald Trump and his organization had shown on documents that this one particular apartment in Manhattan was 30,000 square feet when in fact it was 10,000 square feet. And they said it was worth $200 million when in fact appraisers, I think, that you can trust said that it was on the $50 million range. But the question became, well, why would Donald Trump exaggerate something along those lines? And so Rachel Maddow is considering and pontificating and talking to experts about why she would do this, he would do this, or his organization would do this. And she's talking to incredible minds, from the New York Times and others that are actual experts in this, right? And they do get it right, and for the most part, but they're not broadening it to the bigger story, which is, and this is what I'm trying to get you folks to understand. This is how the smoke and mirrors works. So it's safe for Rachel Maddow to go after Trump and all of his insanity. I mean, it's a clown show, and to take an apartment that is 10,000 square feet and say it's 30,000 square feet is your first red flag, and then all of the rest that comes with it. But the question is, well, why would he do that? Well, it's part of control fraud, because when you hyperinflate asset value, you can borrow against that asset value. And that's part of Donald Trump's business model. You borrow. He's been saying that since the 80s. He's not shy about that. He says it all the time. And so what he's in the midst of is control fraud. But what Rachel Maddow doesn't understand is that Donald Trump is at best a mid-level player in context to what I just laid out for you with regards to what Wall Street did the entirety between, let's call it the late 90s for maybe a starting time period to 2007, where Bear Stearns was the first blow up, and then ultimately most people think of the crash of Lehman Brothers as what constitutes 2008, but nobody understands what actually created the collapse of 2008. Donald Trump is in the midst of one piece of what caused the great financial crisis. Now, further, and I do think that I hope that this gets somehow hot out there, is that Donald Trump also was revealed in 2012 to have sued Deutsche Bank, his primary lender, who was making all these loans because of the control fraud that we're talking about, which is the same control fraud that was happening at Citigroup. And of course, Deutsche Bank's from Germany, which has a huge connection to Russia, and there's a whole lot of money laundering going on there. But in this particular case, the magnitude of Rachel's miss is such that, again, it's safe for her to target Donald Trump because of the political circus and her business model that you've got to reach people that are never Trumpers or any number of demographics that might be liberal that are just the opposite of what Donald Trump has been in the midst of. And she gets her 1 to 3% a night. I mean, those are big numbers and justify a $30 million a year salary. From what I understand, I think that's where she is now. I know that it was quite a bit less, and I'm not sure if that's accurate. But the bottom line is, she is one of those people that we listen to, and she's getting the story wrong. She's getting that much of the story when, of course, if Donald Trump is out of control with his little hands on something where he amplified the value of an apartment, from $50 to $250 million, what are we talking about in terms of what I just told you? Wall Street walking with $29 trillion. I think most of you know the math is that there's 1,000 billion in a trillion. It's like the sun compared to a piece of sand on the beach. I mean, it's insanity, my friends. And the flip side of that is recently I happened to see, God, this feature that Tucker Carlson did on Fox, and I like I don't watch Fox. I watch it every once in a while to try to see what they're talking about, how they frame things, just to kind of get a sense of it. But in this particular case, it was really off the charts nauseating. Um, Tucker Carlson had this huge expose on homelessness being this national scourge, and he blamed it on two things. People that are homeless, he says, are people that he believes, I didn't see a lot of any evidence or interviews or anything to this, he just attests to it, that people who are homeless want to be homeless because they're drug addicts and they can get drugs on the street. But his bigger point was that the cities are encouraging it. In fact, he went so far as to say developers are building free housing in Seattle that have these beautiful views of the Space Needle and I guess, the volcano. I can't even think of Mount Shasta is down in Oregon, but you know what I'm saying. It looks like Mount Olympus outside of Seattle. Beautiful, right? But what his broader point is, yeah, developers are happy to take the state's money and build free housing. But what he's saying is, why would we give money to drug addicts and thieves and people who don't want to live in society when we could make that money available for small business loans? I mean, my God, this guy Tucker Carlson has absolutely no understanding that there was, for example, or maybe he does. I mean, I've seen him do stuff, for example, on private equity that I actually thought was relatively impressive, and I don't know why you can't put two and two together in this particular situation, except for he gets paid a lot of money, probably not to. And that's my point of fake media in both directions. And Tucker Carlson is a guy that, is blaming this excruciating suffering on millions of people, many of whom may have drug dependency issues right now and all sorts of problems because they got ground down in the courts and everything else, losing their houses after the great financial crisis. And I know many of the percentage of these people, particularly in California, came out of that excruciating disaster. I want you guys to think about this. Look, Osama bin Laden, right? Osama bin Laden puts together this hit job on the United States. He wants to create this, this spectacular event. And I know there's a lot of people, and it's controversial about, to some people, what may or may not have happened and who's covering up what. But just on its face, Osama bin Laden and 19 hijackers from Saudi Arabia conspire to fly 4 airliners into, the Twin Towers and, of course, the Pentagon. And then the other one went down in Western PA, of course, in Shanksville, which I've been to. And, the nature and the magnitude of that disaster was north of 4,000, well, roughly 4,000 people died. Could have been like 30,000 that day, but it was like 4,000 people that got evaporated in the Twin Towers and all of the other places that I just mentioned. And then ultimately we had wars in the Middle East that I think north of 1 million people probably died in those wars. And, not to mention all of the suffering and the things that would happen in Syria after the fact. I mean, this has gone on for much of the last 20 years. It's extravagantly huge, the impact of that disaster. But let's consider for a second, and I'm not trying to say one is worse than the other, but I am trying to say that I really need the world to understand that because of everything I'm laying out to you and what Wall Street did, we had upwards of 16 million filed foreclosures in 2012. 16 million. I mean, I think most people are saying there was 10 million houses collapsed. I don't think we can get a real accurate number. Some official numbers say it's 5 million. Most are saying it's 10 million. I've seen 16 million. I still think the number's probably more. But in any case, we're talking about tens of millions of people that got directly destroyed in the United States as a result of a criminal enterprise that we not only rewarded the people that had engineered this entire problem with $29 trillion, but none of them got investigated or went to prison. We had just a whole array of settlements, and many people believe that Wall Street paid off all of its debt or its loans, and it did by a whole variety of murky ways. But at the same time, they paid $250 billion collectively for a $29 trillion getaway. It's a pretty good cost of doing business. But going back to the beginning, this country is supposed to be a country of laws where nobody is above the law. We hear it night in and night out by people like Rachel Maddow, who say because President Trump or former President Trump, has been this disaster, that the Department of Justice has to step up and deal with this calamity. Now, recently she's also shown, for example, document fabrication that suddenly occurred to her that apparently Giuliani is involved with as it relates to state certifications in the election. All very compelling stuff and all very interesting to watch, but it's really just mind-blowing to me. And I know the millions of you out there that are aware that there was millions upon millions of documentation fraud in the liar loans that made up what created the 2008 Great Financial Crisis, not to mention that there was, I've got access to at least 75,000 pieces of documentation fraud that was used to foreclose on people illegally. I got to assume, based on what I've seen, that that number is spectacularly larger. And I think that there were millions upon millions of illegal foreclosures. I've worked in this situation for a very long time. I know that I've interacted with a lot of incredible attorneys. Some are honest and genuine and do the right stuff, and many aren't. And the ones that are the real deal tell you behind the scenes that the judges know that this is going on. In fact, I know of one guy in Miami who is, I believe, incredibly courageous, that has done everything in his power to make everyone aware and known that these foreclosure cases are using fraudulent documents by servicers and foreclosure mills, and that everybody in on it knows about it, as well as the judges. And this has been going on, guys, for a very long time. So again, let's contrast what the mainstream media is telling us about Donald Trump and documentation fabrication as it relates to Rudolph Giuliani and the likes of multi-state certification fraud, which is a horrible crime in itself. And in the old days, just enough of that would be so scandalous that the entire country would come to a screeching halt. But instead, it's just like another day, right? There's so much noise. There's so much misinformation. There's so much disinformation. But all I am trying to convey to every one of you from where I am at this very frustrating moment is that there is a literal criminal enterprise that exists above the law, that acts and operates with impunity, that looks legitimate, that comes out of the best universities of this country, that works side by side with the most notable law firms and the most powerful law firms in this country to skirt the institutions of justice. I have people on camera, we have people on camera, for example, former director of investigations who was third at the FBI, who told us on camera that he had this dragnet that put together the entirety of what it is that I'm revealing to you back in 2004. And what then AG Gonzalez did, who was working for the Bush administration, is he basically took resources away, stopped the investigation, and ultimately put resources into things like, quite frankly, and I'm not making this up, pornography. This while literally millions of people were in the crosshairs of what would become this devastation of 2008. And incidentally, I should point out, and we cover this in the con as well, that at that time period, President Bush's largest contributor was a gentleman by the name of Roland Arnault, who was the CEO of AmeriQuest, who was up to his eyeballs in this incredible documentation fraud and liar's loans, who actually created, according to Bill Black, the vector that created the entirety of this madness, that ultimately became the ambassador to the Netherlands during the Bush administration because he was literally the single largest contributor to George W. Bush. Think about that. Larger than Exxon, larger than fill in your blank military industrial complex. This is how big this was. Now, incidentally, this particular case with Roland Arnall got snuffed out by 49 state AGs. They brought this massive civil suit against Roland Arnall for predatory lending, and the company was nailed for the largest multi-state action in American history. This was bigger than the tobacco settlement, but it was a drop in the bucket of what was coming in 2008. Here's the thing. We have never resolved what happened as a result of 2008. We have put this into the con, painstakingly did it correct. We talked to the best people, the ones who have the answers. We revealed it all. And what happened? Ultimately, we've been relegated to have to do self-distribution because, I don't have evidence of this, but Netflix and HBO, for example, which would have been the perfect places for this particular broadcast because of the nature of how many people were in the crosshairs of this, and finally the truth is known, but they didn't want to put it out there. Now, obviously, I wasn't the one dealing with the acquisition execs, so I don't know exactly what their motivations were, but I can tell you, and maybe this is just anecdotal, but for example, a large operation in the financial system, the biggest, BlackRock, is the majority shareholder of Netflix. Netflix is actually losing some money right now, but it's BlackRock that is really an extension of everybody we expose in the con. Now, HBO, who I respect immensely in all the content and everything that they've done for the years, but we couldn't get this on HBO. There was some initial interest from HBO, but eventually we got turned down, as we got turned down everywhere. And then again, anecdotally, Time Warner went through a large mega merger and acquisition last summer that was negotiated by none other than Chase and Goldman Sachs, both of whom we expose in the con. Might acquisitions execs who are smart, who could read the tea leaves, who know where their career is going, not want to expose that the ones who provide financing for all of their programs that they're green lighting be exposed for the largest criminal conspiracy and cover-up in history? I don't think so. So here we are, and here I am. I'm just back from a walk. I deal with this every single day, and I've finally come to the conclusion that I've got to give up. It's not worth it anymore. I mean, I have personally lost everything in this pursuit of justice and the truth. I mean, I'll take you back to in 2008 when my life was, falling apart around me. I'll never forget looking into my son's eyes, and I think he was like 4 years old at the time, and I drove to Little Cottonwood Canyon in Utah, and I went and I crawled up on a big rock, and I thought about sending it, which is a terminology when you live in the mountains when you jump off cliffs. I was ready to end it, and I remember sitting up there that day, and I was so distraught, and I was so depressed, and I was so lost that I just made a promise to myself that I was going to find the answers. Now, thank God for me, I found the right people to help me get the answers, to fund this incredible journey to go get those answers. But we did. And after all of that incredibly difficult process, that was like, moving a giant boulder to the top of Everest backwards without shoes on. But we did it. And we did it. And it was just so freaking remarkable because my partners demanded it. And quite frankly, Eric Vaughn, our director, who's, I think, one of the greatest human beings I've ever known in my life, is Michelangelo. This was the Sistine Chapel. And now we've gotten it out there to the world. And the millions upon millions of people that are looking for answers don't know it exists. And even when they do find it, they're like, I don't think I want to watch it because, I don't know, I can't be inside their heads. But my guess is that, maybe they want to look through their Instagram account, or like I do myself. If you get on, that what's it called, TikTok, you can lose an hour and be like, oh, well, I was thinking about watching it, but now I'm going to go watch the football game. I mean, this is a cultural thing, guys, and I don't know if we're completely so lost in translation that we don't have the capacity to understand right and wrong. I don't know if we have the desire to. I think that most of us has just given up. I think most of us are like where I am now, where it's like there's nothing we can do. That this does not end well. And the thing that bothers me above all else, like there wasn't enough to be bothered by through this whole, whatever this is. The people that are the most motivated are the ones who just want to blame people of different colors or races or genders, or people that are victims, and they want to come together in this sort of like brash, let's make America great again, by what? Championing a guy who's a complete freaking criminal? What credibility is there? I know people that are in the court system who've lost their homes, who know about the corruption in the courts, who literally think Donald Trump is their savior. Meanwhile, he's a guy that was practicing in predatory lending with Trump mortgages and Trump university, where he got busted for predatory lending. And I think the only suit he's ever copped to was a $25 million civil settlement that was based on predatory loans that were just part of this whole thing. It's my actual, thought process that Donald Trump knew about all of the documentation fabrication back as this whole thing was happening, when he had, the Trump mortgage, and not to mention the fact that he knew about appraisal fraud because of his entire, stuff that Rachel Maddow is putting out, which is a control fraud. So would you ever put it past a guy like Donald Trump, who's lied, I think, over 5,000 times, that he'd be like, wow, what if I create, the big lie and make it out that the election was stolen against me, and then engineer document fabrication, because he's playing the media that's playing everybody, that's getting played by the justice system, and it's just a rat race of insanity and stupid, selfish, criminal behavior apart everybody that's in the apparatus of power. And that's what I'm trying to express to you guys. Look, who am I? I'm just a guy, right? I'm just a regular guy. I'm just a guy that, wanted to provide for his family. I'm just a guy that, wanted to be honest and live with, justice, and be, somebody who could be somebody that my son could look up to. But instead, I've literally lost everything. I'm in the process of, going through a divorce. I mean, I wiped out heavily last year. My son's got issues, and it's like I'm just living the same life that so many people express to me. Like I got a guy on Twitter the other day that said, oh yeah, man, I lost my house. I lost my wife. I got divorced. I wanted to commit suicide. I ended up homeless. And then ultimately I beat Wells Fargo. And I was like, oh man, I want to hear your story. But what I'm also trying to sync with everybody that's out there on all sides of the ideological, political divide, and, that are confused beyond comprehension. We have proved the corruption. You don't have to ask and wonder who did what, when, and how, and who covered it up and why. We present that to you on a platinum platter. You got to know the facts. And if we came together, we could overcome the corruption that's murdering us all. That's what I'm trying to tell you. I believe that forever, but I've lost hope. I don't think I can carry on anymore with this. I kind of feel like I got to quit. That's why I'm making this recording now, because it's kind of a last-ditched effort. I'll be honest with you. It occurred to me, I wanted to do something sensational. I thought about flying to New York and throwing a pie at Jamie Dimon and having it go viral. Ridiculous, idea, but I'm not going to do that. And but it occurred to me. I'm like, I wonder if people will be like, oh my God, why would that guy throw a pie at Jamie Dimon that would go viral? And then people start going, well, oh, wait a second. That's the guy that made this television series investigative program called The Con that reveals that Jamie Dimon is a 5-time recidivist, that his company is literally owns the United States government, and Obama worked for him. And oh, by the way, Rob Reiner and all the rest of the liberals that are saying now that Biden might have a Supreme Court justice pick to, put Obama in there. The guy who let Wall Street get away with this insanity that led to Trump and has created this madness of this empire in a death spiral. Yeah, sure. It would make sense to put Obama in the Supreme Court, and I'll tell you why. The Supreme Court this last year had a case of Goldman Sachs, who was being sued by the Arkansas Teacher Pension Union and the National Pipe Fitters Union because of illegal reps and warranties and deception that blew up their retirement savings because they were shorted in what was the 2008 great financial crisis. And I can guarantee you, my friends who've seen The Big Short, that the folks that were depicted were not even close to what ultimately happened. A gentleman by the name of John Paulson, not to be mistaken for Hank Paulson, who was Secretary of Treasury at the time, who came from Goldman Sachs, but John Paulson and a guy named Paolo Pellegrini were hedge fund guys that got involved with doing a Big Short. And there's a lot more to that story, but ultimately Goldman Sachs set up pensions, what they refer to as stupid money. I am not kidding you. Teachers and workers are thought of as dumb or stupid money. They just get pilfered, state pensions, from these huge financial apparatuses. And the Supreme Court basically ruled on behalf of Goldman because they didn't investigate the facts, which is what we have done in the con. I don't know why I'm the guy that's telling you all this stuff. Again, I'm just a regular person. I'm a citizen of the United States, and I'm just trying to be a citizen. We expect pilots who fly 747s to know what they're doing so we can get from point A to point Z successfully. Same with those who build our buildings, same with those who build our bridges, same with those who do any number of things that any of us could get destroyed by. So why wouldn't we have the same expectation of our government and our financial system? Well, of course we do. But they betrayed us. And they continue to betray us because you do not understand what happened. I don't know if you're going to click Rent, honestly. We've set this thing up where you get 5 episodes of the truth that the United States government gets paid $75 billion a year to prevent. That led to a $29 trillion heist that's led to another 30 trillion cents, to be quite honest with you. And it's happening every single day. Didn't accomplish. And we're charging $2 an episode for this monumental truth. You know, look, man, say what you will about the free market and say what you will about capitalism and communism and fascism and all of the other isms. Look, man, corruption infiltrates all of them. If you don't have the integrity of the rule of law and the right people holding the bad guys accountable, you're going to have absolute chaos. So, you know, if you don't want to spend $2 for the truth that destroyed your life, okay, go listen to Rachel Maddow, go listen to, Tucker Carlson, go listen to frickin' Donald Trump and Rudolph Giuliani, and go listen to whomever like Obama tell you what the truth is. They're all lying to you. You don't know me. You don't know anything about me. But I'm telling you the truth. And I think I'm done trying because I don't think most of you want to listen anyway. And if that's the case, then good luck to us. But I hope, 1 in 10 of you were raised like I was, even though I look like a slob right now, even though I look like crap. I was raised by 2 incredibly beautiful people that are professionals, that live with integrity and had always lived with doing the right thing. And that's how I was able to understand when I was looking at the wrong thing, because like the 2 greatest films of the 90s that inspired really my thinking, there was 2 that set this whole journey up. The first was The Usual Suspects, when Kevin Spacey said the greatest trick the devil ever played was to convince the world he didn't exist. I simply channeled my inner Ezekiel Rollins in Devil in a Blue Dress when he got tired of them pissing on my head, telling me it was rain. America, woke is a joke, but being understanding of the corruption that is destroying us all is the only thing that's going to save us. And I pray somehow, some way, this message gets to the people that need it to hear it the most. Nobody's going to come to your rescue. They're going to destroy you. They'll destroy all of us. They already have. The only way we can save this country and ourselves and just the rule of law and the integrity of our system and the country and democracy and all of the rest of it is if we come together to rise above to purge corruption. I propose to do it peacefully, civilly. I think that we have to press on organizations of power, and I think we have to find people amongst ourselves to elevate into positions of power to overcome this madness, because corruption has been killing us for decades now, and it's only going to get worse. If you want to be a part of the solution, save your family, save yourself, save the future. The best, easiest way to get the information in a way that could put us all on the same page, quite frankly, is the Con, and it's at www.thecon.tv. And I don't know what else to do. I gave it my last best chance effort. Now I'm going to sign off and just let the chips fall where they may. Onward and upwards, America. I hope we can come together. Be well.